It's great. It's great to be with you. I'm Steve. I'm Mason. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for WUSC, and I've worked for WUSC for just over 2 years. So I'm actually a relative newcomer to an organization that has a very long history. So as mentioned today, I'm going to be diving into a little bit about our views on the current landscape for higher education as a complementary pathway for refugee protection. And just before I do that, I'll just give you a little bit of a snapshot about who WUSC is and what we do, and sort of frame my remarks in that context. So WUSC is a global development organization, and we work around the world with the overarching vision of a world where all young people thrive and belong. And we pursue that vision primarily through looking at the education and economic opportunities that are available to young people, especially young people who are vulnerable or have been marginalized in one way or another. And as a particular focus, we have for a long time worked with refugees and displaced populations as one of our core demographics of people that we support. WUSC doesn't exclusively work with refugee and displaced population. We work in around 30 countries in Africa, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Asia, really looking at the broader issues that are facing young people in the world. And I think as everyone who lives in this world knows, there are many barriers to young people to access quality education, affordable quality education, and make a transition from education into meaningful and dignified and fulfilling work. So that's really where WUSC works on those issues. WUSC was founded a really long time ago, actually. We came into being after the First World War, if you can believe it, in the early 1920s. And right at the very roots of our organization was the effort to work with young people who had been displaced by World War I and help them continue their education journeys. So that aspect of working with young people to allow them to continue education when they had been displaced by conflict goes back to our very founding as an organization over 100 years ago. So really, supporting education pathways for displaced populations is part of WUSC's DNA. And we've built on that DNA substantially over the years. And I think some of you may be aware that almost for 50 years now, we've been running a program in Canada called the Student Refugee Program. And this is a program through which we resettle young refugees as first-year undergraduate students at Canadian universities and colleges. And that project came into being in 1978, and it has grown into being the largest education complementary pathway for refugees. Each year, we resettle around 150 young students from various refugee settings to study in Canada, working with a network of over 100 higher education institutions and around 1,200 volunteers on campuses across the country. We have big ambitions for what we want to do about refugee resettlement and especially education pathways. We have a goal over the next 5 years to double the number of young refugees that we resettle to Canada, from the current 150 up to 300. But we also have a major objective to support the growth and development of complementary education pathways in other countries, which is really where our initial relationship with DME started that we're building on now. So we are trying to support as many countries as we can to either develop a new pathway or to grow the pathway we have. And we've had quite a lot of success so far in a number of countries, as diverse as Mexico, of course, the Philippines, and at one point, and in the past, and again at one point in the future, the United States, through the Welcome Core on Campus program. So why are we doing this? Why do we think that resettling refugees through an education pathway is the smart thing to do? Well, there's a number of reasons for that. And I think it's first and foremost important to say that higher education is increasingly seen and recognized as a vital protection pathway for refugees. And it really does bridge emergency humanitarian aid with a long-term durable solution. The pathway is also well recognized as a way to ensure strong integration for refugees into a third country. When you enter a country in a campus setting as a first-year student, you are immediately taken into a community of people who are in the same trajectory as you. You're all in first year, you're all studying, and you're brought into the country in a way that is where many people are experiencing things for the first time. It's also been shown that education pathways are highly beneficial to the receiving country. Most countries where refugees are being resettled, Canada included, require immigrants for their labor needs. And when they bring refugees into first-year undergrads, then those refugees get the skill set required to become meaningful contributors to the society, meaningful taxpayers, and meaningful pillars of society. And finally, education pathways have been shown to have a knock-on positive effect on education in first countries of asylum. So we have a lot of anecdotal evidence that we're hoping to turn into something a little bit more rigorous. In the camps where WUSC has been working to select students for many years, like in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya or in Dzaleka in Malawi, we've seen that parents of children in those camps are prioritizing education for their children because they know of the possibility of resettlement through an education pathway. So we see higher success rates and higher completion rates throughout the primary and secondary education cycles, which sets refugees better up for long-term success if they get resettled or even if they don't. So having said all that, where are we at? There's a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities. So I think it's important first to say that only 9% of refugees currently have access to higher education. So that may seem like a small number, and it is indeed a small number, but just 7 years ago, that number was only 1%. So the number is growing. More refugees are getting access to higher education. We do expect to see a few setbacks because of the recent global aid cuts that have happened over the last year, but nonetheless, the number has been growing. However, that still compares very unfavorably to the number of people in general who have access to higher education, which is around 42%. So you can see there's a gap there between the 9% of refugees who have access and the 42% of other people who do. But that gap for us is an opportunity. There are currently around 30 dedicated education pathway initiatives for refugees around the world. Canada, Mexico, many European countries, Australia, the Philippines, South Korea, and more. Most of these initiatives have just recently been built. So that shows a relatively new commitment from some governments and the higher education sector globally to take action and improve the state of education opportunities for refugees. We believe there's a lot of room to grow in each of those 30 pathways, in addition to supporting new ones to emerge. In addition, we're seeing an enthusiasm on the part of post-secondary institutions to admit displaced students on their campus. Universities, as many of you know, tend to be very socially minded. A lot of very progressive attitudes exist on campus. So amongst both students and faculty, we see an appetite to do this and an appetite to grow existing programs. These actions are more needed than ever, of course. I don't need to tell any of you that we're in a world of ever-present and increasing conflict. It's estimated that by the end of 2026, there will be an additional 7 million people who will be displaced globally. And that will bring the total of refugee and displaced populations in the world up to over 120 million. Protracted refugee crises are likely to continue, and those require long-term solutions. We've been working in camps like Kakuma in Kenya that have been there for 50 years, right? These camps are not going anywhere, and solutions are needed. And the projected need for resettlement, is over 2.5 million refugees at the end of 2026. So we feel like we're making a drop in the bucket, but a drop that can grow. But there are barriers, of course. And, I'm just going to talk about a few of the barriers that we are really seeing in this space. I mean, first and foremost, the global aid sector is in crisis. I think we're all aware with the massive destruction of USAID. That was just the canary in the coal mine of a global aid sector that is in collapse. Almost every major bilateral donor, and Canada included, has reduced its aid envelopes in 2025 or 2026. What this means is that there's major disruptions in the continuity of aid provided to vulnerable populations, including refugees, and we're expecting to see increased displacement numbers and decreased opportunities for young refugees. On top of that, the world is grappling with stricter immigration policies that are deterring asylum claimants and impacting international refugee protection. And that, again, is a global phenomenon that this is being cracked down and fewer opportunities are emerging. And in many cases, resettlement numbers are decreasing. Again, Canada is a case in point where settlement numbers have gone down this year. Complementary to that and very much related is a global backlash against refugees and immigrants and an anti-immigrant and anti-refugee narrative that is making it harder for committed stakeholders to develop meaningful long-term solutions for displaced people in these environments. We see this all the time at WUSC in our campus groups, where the students who used to run these and volunteer on these programs used to be, universally lauded for doing, really God's work, and now they're criticized. Why are you supporting refugees and not the needy Canadian students? So it's become more difficult for people to do this work and more psychosocially challenging. On top of that, there are actually specific barriers for refugees themselves to access higher education, especially in third countries. So we hear many cases of refugees who get accepted to study at a Canadian institution or another institution. They have the grades, they sometimes even have the money, but they do not get the visa to come to the country because they cannot demonstrate an intention to return. And for the most part, international students around the world, if they're going to study in a third country, to get the visa, they are required to show that they intend to return to their country of origin. No government has a national policy framework in place to address a double intent, both to study and for long-term protection. And finally, in terms of barriers, there, of course, is a major financing barrier. While many refugees, of course, will qualify for admission into a post-secondary education institution, they do not have the resources to do so. And the programs to provide those resources, like the UNHCR's, what's it called, DAFTA, I always forget the exact acronym, but you know what I'm talking about. That's basically being put on hold. So many opportunities for refugees to study are stopped at the financing level. But there are opportunities. So I don't want to leave you on a negative note. I want to leave you on a positive note. First of all, I think there's a lot of new activity and cross-learning and discussion that is going on amongst all the organizations that are working in this space. I know my colleagues have been to many conferences and roundtables to share lessons, to share experiences, and to grow collaborations, like the collaboration that WUSC and USCRI are hoping to do together. So that's a positive opportunity where we're actually learning from each other, trying to see where the core barriers are and trying to figure out ways to unlock them together. Many post-secondary institutions themselves are trying to open up their opportunities for refugee students, and also involved in exchanging best practice and lessons learned. We're seeing in many cases more flexible admission policies that take into account the lived experience of refugee populations. So it's not all grade-based, for example, but experience-based. And we're seeing new types of financial assistance programs that are coming in through organizations like the MasterCard Foundation, who has now set a target that of its global scholars program, 25% should be refugee and displaced populations. Some governments are thinking about dual intent as a pathway. Canada actually has been working on drafting an international student policy for refugees, which would allow the people to apply without having to prove that they intend to return to their home country. That, of course, has been a little bit delayed by some of the other goings-on, but we're optimistic that it will emerge and that will be seen as a good practice that other countries can emulate. And we're seeing many more new opportunities actually in countries of first asylum for refugees. So again, through programs like the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Program, they've made strategic partnerships with some big institutions in Africa, like the U.S. International University in Nairobi, like Sheshe University in Ghana, to take on significant numbers of refugees from those countries and from neighboring countries into their academic programs and fully funded scholarships. So we're seeing many more of those opportunities emerge, maybe not in the West, but domestically, where closer to where refugees are. And then, there's a bunch of us that are trying to think outside the box. What more can we do to expand this pathway? So one example I'll give you here is that WUSC recently did a pilot of a train-to-hire program. So rather than being an exclusively education pathway, it's a mixed education and labor pathway. So the example here is that in one province in Canada, in Nova Scotia, there's a massive shortage of pharmacists. The province needs pharmacists, and they can't get enough Canadian pharmacists. So we worked with them to identify skilled pharmacists that were basically Syrian and Iraqi refugees living in Jordan. And the College of Pharmacists in Nova Scotia accredited their degree and basically indicated that they would require a 3-month upskilling to become pharmacists in Canada. So we brought the first cohort over of 25 young refugees who are currently doing their 3-month upskilling, while at the same time working as pharmacist assistants. And after those 3 months, they will become fully licensed pharmacists and then have access to a 6-figure salary within 3 months of arriving in Canada. So mixing that education and labor mobility pathways, we see lots of opportunities for that to expand in the future.